You saw in video number 2 of this series that religion has always been a part of science and has usually had a positive influence on scientific advancement. The establishment of the fundamentals of modern physics in the 17th century leading up to Isaac Newton was no exception. The proponents of the new explanations that were needed in the 17th century were all driven by religious concerns, meaning that many fundamental ideas of modern science evolved out of theological ideas. The debate between the varying views of nature in the 17th century was not so much scientific, but was actually waged more on religious grounds. The major players, Johann Baptista von Helmont, Gottfried Leibniz, René Descartes, Pierre Gassendi, and Robert Boyle, all saw Christianity as intimately linked to their view of the universe. Aristotelian natural philosophy, the physics of Aristotle, was still the dominant view of nature at the beginning of the 17th century. According to Aristotle, the earth stood still and objects moved because of their necessary qualities. For example, earth falls towards the center of the universe because that's just the nature of earth. The planetary spheres moved because of their desire to match the eternity of God. So Aristotle had reasons, if you can call them that, for the motions we observe. The adoption of the Copernican heliocentric model created a problem. Heliocentrism now has everything moving, including the Earth, which creates a need for a new explanation of this motion. How did this motion begin? Why does this motion continue? In the 17th century, the answers to these questions were theological. How you answered the question, why do things move, depended on your view of God. The mechanical philosophy of Descartes, Gassendi, and Boyle was in competition to answer this question with two other approaches to nature: spiritualism, represented by Helmont and Leibniz, and Platonism that culminated in the work of Isaac Newton. The main battle in the 17th century between these three camps came down to a religious question. Should the immediate action of God be thought of as separate from the actions of matter? Or should the actions of God be integrated with the actions of matter? The mechanical philosophers regarded matter as entirely passive. The spiritualists regarded matter as active due to the immanence of spirit. And the Platonists saw matter as passive on its own, but activated by spiritual or supra-mechanical principles. Johann Baptista von Helmont, one of the first people to formulate the law of conservation of matter, held to the idea that seminal principles, or ferments, were implanted by God into each substance, thereby explaining the unique character of each chemical. God determined the properties and laws of all things at creation by decree. I believe that nature is the command of God, whereby a thing is that which it is, and doth that which it is commanded to do or act. This is a Christian definition as opposed to an Aristotelian one, taken out of the Holy Scripture. For that most glorious mover, God's Spirit, hath given powers to things, whereby they of themselves and by an absolute force may move themselves or other things. Helmont saw the properties of matter as something implanted into an object at creation. The planets move, for example, because God imparted that nature to them when he created them. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a close friend of Helmont's son, doesn't fit neatly into the spiritual category of Helmont, but his ideas are closest to those of Helmont. Leibniz also looked at nature as having vital principles implanted in matter by God, which he termed monads. To Leibniz, matter had a vitality set as intrinsic to an object at creation, and then put into motion by God. Leibniz viewed nature as a product of the original divine decree by which matter was invested with an energy that would continue indefinitely and undiminished. Out of this idea came an initial version of the law of conservation of energy, one of the crucial big ideas in modern science. The same force and vigor remains always in the world and only passes from one part of matter to another, agreeably to the laws of nature and the beautiful pre-established order. Whoever thinks otherwise must needs have a very mean notion of the wisdom and power of God. Leibniz compared God and nature to a king and his subjects. God is like a king who not only determines the laws, but also educates his subjects and endows them with the capacity to fulfill those laws. In like manner, God makes the natural laws, then provides matter with the capacity to follow those natural laws. For Leibniz, the essence of a thing included union with God as its creator and its obedience to the laws of which God set in place. Matter was not autonomous in the sense of being separate from God. Thus, I hold that even if individual effects in nature can be explained mechanically, nevertheless, even mechanical principles and their effects, all order and all physical rules in general, arise not from purely material determinations, but from the contemplation of indivisible substances, and especially of God. René Descartes, a devout Catholic, was the first to offer a consistent system of natural philosophy to replace Aristotle. He viewed matter as having the property that he termed extension. That is, matter is defined as the stuff that has three dimensions. Descartes dismissed Aristotelian essential natures because of his belief that nature was contingent on God. He dismissed magical forces or actions at a distance because, to Descartes, for something to provide a force, there had to be physical contact. Gravity was an issue because we can't see any physical contact providing the force. So to fix this, Descartes proposed the existence of a type of heavenly material that we can't see but is able to provide the physical force necessary for gravitation. The planets move because they are suspended in this substance that revolves continuously like a vortex with the sun at the center. He compared it to whirlpools that occur on a river and carry objects in a circular motion. The presence of this plenum was a religious necessity for Descartes. He viewed action at a distance as requiring constant miracles from God to provide the force, something he rejected on religious grounds. Descartes did not appeal to a God of the gaps to explain gravity. Instead, he proposed a physical substance he couldn't observe as the cause. Christianity was not a science stopper because this proposal ignited a lot of thought and discussion about what these mysterious forces actually were and whether an empty space that didn't contain any matter could actually exist. Descartes and later Leibniz argued that empty space, or a vacuum, could not exist. So there must be a plenum to explain interactions that we can't see. Leibniz's reasoning on this was also religious. He thought that if a vacuum existed, it would be ascribing to God an imperfect work, and God can't make anything imperfect. Descartes' discussion on the nature of the material world were never separated from his views on the nature and the existence of God. His concept of matter being completely passive grew out of his Christian belief in the immutability and omnipotence of God. Since matter was totally passive, it couldn't behave according to any laws, and it also couldn't continue to exist without the continuous creative action of God. There was no such thing as weight or gravity or magnetism, no causal relations among events. All that existed was a continuum of material bodies. Remember, he didn't believe in a void. So all that existed was a continuum of material bodies in relative motion to each other that are constantly sustained by God through continuous recreation. Descartes' view has been labeled occasionalism, and because matter can't do anything, he thought that God created each event at each instant of time. It looks regular and predictable to us because God is entirely consistent in the way he acts. He always produces the same effects under the same circumstances, what we see as the laws of physics. So out of Descartes' theological Christian beliefs came the modern concept of the laws of nature. Pierre Gassendi, a Catholic priest, took a different approach, but also ended up with a mechanical description of the universe. Gassendi took Epicureanism from ancient Greece and reinvented it within a Christian worldview. The Epicureans thought that everything, including the gods and including our soul, was made up of eternally existing atoms. Gassendi also subscribed to matter being made of atoms. He viewed God as creating a limited amount of matter in an infinite void space, so he believed in a vacuum. He believed that the different properties of matter were due to different sizes and shapes of atoms, and that forces come from atoms colliding. But in order to remain within the Christian worldview, Gassendi made three major adjustments. Atoms were not eternal, and instead had been created by God. The atoms were originally set in motion by God, and the soul was immaterial and not made up of atoms. This was a crucial idea that was used later by Isaac Newton. Again, Christianity was not a science stopper. Instead, Gassendi's religion was the driving force in his reformulation of Epicureanism, and these ideas shifted the course of the mechanical philosophy away from the occasionalism of Descartes toward a more naturalistic view of nature. Robert Boyle pursued scientific inquiry because to him it demonstrated the existence, wisdom, and attributes of God. Boyle also reduced things to matter in motion. Because of Boyle's Christian worldview, that we are created in God's image with at least in part the mind of God, he thought there were useful material explanations that the human mind could comprehend to some level. In other words, nature is understandable, but there are still things we won't understand. Some of examples of Boyle's corpuscular explanations include acid working as a tiny sharp corpuscle that can move in between other corpuscles and force them apart. Heat is many corpuscles moving together in collective motion. And cohesion is corpuscles that link or stick together. Boyle thought that because nature was designed with providence and wisdom, it is organized and purposeful, comparing the universe to a world machine that could run long after God put it all in motion, and God created so perfectly that it didn't require constant adjustment. He viewed the ability of atoms to behave in lawful ways as entirely due to the power of God's original creation, along with something he called God's continuing concourse, which is some kind of ongoing sustaining action. Boyle wanted to demonstrate ways in which science and religion were compatible. This mechanistic view of the universe as a clock or as a machine with God as the designer is one example and allows us to understand and marvel at the wonder of the created order so that we can appreciate the glory of God. This commitment to religion was not a hindrance, but instead was the driving force for Boyle's study of nature. In summary, scientific theories in the 17th century were governed by theological views, differing on the exact role of God, but all connecting their view of how the universe operated to their view of God as the wise creator. None of these natural philosophers, Helmont, Leibniz, Descartes, Gassendi, or Boyle, saw any conflict between their philosophy of nature and their Christian faith. In fact, the advancement of science in the 17th century was inseparable from Christianity. The Christian worldview, far from hindering or holding back science, was what set the stage for Isaac Newton to make his grand synthesis.